Hello all, this is Dr. Waite here again. We are on week 8. It's awesome. This is our last week of class. And so this week we have 2 chapters to cover, and basically some material looking at labor law relating to, and antitrust laws relating to our sports industry. There's the overview video for you to check out, and then of course this video here will be available to review chapter 10 and 11. So I'm going to hop right into it. So for chapter 10, we are looking at antitrust law. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time talking over this. There's a lot of examples for you to read and to look at. But I'm just going to kind of highlight some of the main things and let you take it from there on the reading. So this chapter on antitrust, basically what we're looking at is, defining what is antitrust. So some of the things you're going to learn down here is understanding that federal antitrust laws and how they apply to the sports industry. Types of player restraints that have been reviewed under antitrust laws. There's some great examples of player restraints. Types of exemptions from this antitrust law that apply to professional sports. There's actually a really interesting example on the Los Angeles Raiders at the time, so dating back a while, when Al Davis, the owner, actually won a lot of money due to antitrust laws being updated then. Kind of interesting case there that this chapter highlights. And then the history of team movement and the ways that antitrust laws affect the movement of teams in professional sports. The specific ways antitrust laws have been used to regulate college athletics. And I'm actually going to highlight this in a minute because I think it's kind of interesting to look at the differences in college versus professional. So a big thing about the antitrust law is its purpose. So the goal of this law is to promote competition and efficiency in the marketplace. So we want level playing field, but we also want growth. So protect consumers from the growing monopoly power of big businesses. So not allowing big business to come in and outbuy and overrun. Example that I see, I'm a big soccer fan, so I see this in the English Premier League. Where you can have very rich, wealthy people come in and buy a team and then just buy as many players as they want. They recognize that as an issue and put a cap on that. Major League Soccer here in the United States has a very strict cap on that. You can only have, I think it's like 2 or 3 designated players that make over a certain amount. So you can't monopolize the industry and just buy your way to the top. That's the goal. And then, of course, maintain a high level of competition among producers so that consumers can obtain quality products at reasonable prices. So that's kind of like the main overview. Some of the laws that are discussed in particular that I'll let you read through on your own is the Sherman Act, there's a Clayton Act, Sports Broadcasting Act, and then the Curt Flood Act. Those are all big cases that defined some of the antitrust laws. So some interesting things. So this kind of talks about, starting off, it looks at like player drafts, player restraints. So after the different acts, so after the Clayton Act, it goes into league structure and basically, discussing how sports leagues have an infrastructure and have to follow certain regulations based on the antitrust laws that are embedded within. And then some restrictions on players themselves. So drafting players, talks about that. Talks about free agency. So the time frame when one organization can try and contact another organization's player when they're available. And there's some interesting clauses for certain sports. So baseball has a unique reserve clause embedded in their sport. There's some restrictions in free agency for NFL in particular. I know for English Premier League, for the soccer teams, there's like an internationally known free agency time frame during the summer. It's like a little over a month long when you can negotiate. And then salary caps, I mentioned earlier, Major League Soccer is an example of capping salaries. And there's some exemptions that fall into these laws as well. What I wanted to highlight was actually what I think is the most interesting one was college sports. So it talks about individual sport performance and how they're regulated. But when you get into college athletics, we're transitioning from professionals who have regulations based off the league to really college is just the NCAA, right? They are the most strict, highly regulated, dominate the sports industry for college athletics. The goal within the NCAA is to create an equal playing field, and they do that through the introduction of certain laws. Obviously, the playing field is not always going to be perfect, but if you limit things like recruiting and academic eligibility, a player you can't just recruit someone who, basically is not intelligent enough to accomplish a degree. They can't just show up and just play sports and not go to class. You can't just you got to have at least a 2.0 GPA to stay eligible. So there's no underwater basket weaving for the jock that you want to recruit. That's probably a mean way of saying it, but that's the reality of it. So there are regulations set in place to make sure that things are fair. Like, you are a student first and then an athlete, and that's the NCAA stance on that. Financial aid standards, agent regulations, amateurism rules. One of the things interesting to me is the amateur rule, and I don't think I think it's highlighted within the text, but there's no specific slide on here. But this is changing a bit because the NCAA is now allowing players to market themselves and make money off their own name. So the laws embedded here have changed, and they're adapting as we witness it. So we are living out the change in this current form here. So that's a bit on the antitrust. So feel free to read through some of those different cases to get a better understanding. The next thing is labor law, and that's kind of what comes out of the antitrust law. Is how do we define labor in sport? And so the big thing is understanding where labor laws were developed in the U.S. And then what rights employees have based off of these laws. And then, of course, the tools that employees can obtain or can use to obtain their goals through collective bargaining negotiations. And really what it comes down to is when you're employed at an institution, you're both trying to get something out of each other. Collectively, you want to be successful. When you use college, for example, NCAA has regulations that overlook the institution, and in turn, the institution hires employees and regulates them. But at the same time, it goes full circle because the NCAA also wants to protect the employers and employees. So it's a three-way triangle, as you could say. But there's regulations within that kind of monitor how these are, organized and played out. So labor law in general, we know from outside of sports realm that labor law really began during the Industrial Revolution, where basically unions were developed to protect the employees because they were being overworked and underpaid. And so the goal with labor laws was really to give the employee some power. So moving forward, if we look at just sports in general, so you can go through and read more of the background on labor laws, but if you look at how it affects sports, there are unions involved in sports and athletics, especially in the professional realm. The first union came out of the NBA, but now there are unions for player support in MLB, NFL, NHL, and even MLS, I believe. So there's lots of sports using unions. Now, NCAA and unions, this is kind of interesting. So talking about outside of professional sports, looking at the college level. So it says in 2014, a group of football players filed a petition to unionize. It was controversial because the NCAA does not recognize its athletes as employees. The court appealed the control test to determine whether athletes were employees. Basically, what it comes down to is, at the moment, athletes are not considered employees, so you can't form a union because you're not protecting employees, you're protecting athletes. So, and that's where we are today, is how this is all kind of changing, because now athletes can market themselves. So does that change their status? But they're marketing outside of their university and making income outside of that, but they're using the university and their role on that team to market themselves. So things may get a little tricky as to how that happens, and I think we'll get to see more of that unfold. So some things to look into: collective bargaining, defining that and how it works in athletics. Things that pop up like lockout, decertification, strikes, how wages are handled, hours. Hours is kind of interesting. So for pro athletes, focuses on number of games, but also what about all the off-season work? So that all goes into the pay. Like you have to show up for camp. If you don't show up, do you get paid? And so that's all worked into your agreement as a professional athlete when you sign with them, and that all goes under the conditions of employment. So there's some different regulations on that as well. So some good content to look through, understanding it. Most of this would be kind of review if you understand labor law in general, but how it actually applies to athletics is very different. I would say the biggest differences would be between really professional sports versus college athletics. So there's some changes that are still occurring that we will see happen in the next few years, I'm sure. So as always, if you have any questions after you get through the reading, feel free to shoot me an email, and I'll be happy to respond. Otherwise, don't forget to take the quiz on this content and finish our last assignment for this week. And thank you all for joining, and good luck on your future classes here at Cal Baptist.